Welcome back to the Appraisd podcast, Navigating Performance Management, your compass to HR success. And in today's episode, we're going to focus on a somewhat divisive theme, the year-end review, also known as the old annual appraisal, although we like to think we've changed the meaning of this now. Now, although most companies are sold on continuous performance management, that's certainly what we advocate. For many organizations, there is still a place for an annual review of some sort, looking back, reflecting, and making plans for the future, and thinking about this over a kind of longer timescale rather than just what happened last month and what we're going to do next month. Think about the last 12 months and looking forward to the next year, for example. And the run up to Christmas is a notoriously busy time for HR. And amidst all the other priorities HR has to manage, such as payroll, recruitment, the annual review takes time and resources, especially if it includes compensation elements such as promotion or bonus. And speaking to HR professionals, we often find they spend weeks in the run up to Christmas administering it, which sounds kind of painful. And it's especially painful if you're doing this on paper or Word docs or Excel. But anyway, we'll come on to that. So how can HR get organized and change their role in this busy time of year from administrative to strategic, which is what they really want to be doing? And this is what we aim to address in this episode, where we've invited Richard Brereton, Appraisd's Head of Customer Success. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Roly. It's good to be here.
Good. Right. Well, I've got lots of questions for you, and hopefully we'll get through most of them. Okay, so let's start off with this. So most companies are sold on continuous performance management, right? They know that it's so much better to have regular, frequent communication with your manager to get feedback quickly in the moment, minimal documentation, just the kind of essentials, keeping check on objectives, all that kind of stuff. And that's fantastic. That's the way we should be doing things. However, we believe there is still this place occasionally from an annual review or a reflection where you kind of look back over a longer period. So from your experience with appraised customers, what would you say is the biggest challenge this sort of time of year, the run up to Christmas, for HR teams who still have a year-end review, especially the ones who are doing this in Word documents and Excel spreadsheets?
Yes, so as you touched on, Roly, I think a lot of our clients still do the annual review and find it really useful, whether that's something quite light touch for those doing continuous, a sort of, as you mentioned, a catch up at the end of the year, just a reflection. But we also do have some that are doing something a bit more substantive at the end of the year. And I'd say the biggest challenge is probably timeframes. Actually, is getting started as quickly as possible. As you get into December, which is when many people like to conduct their reviews, people start going on holiday, they're using up annual leave that's left at the end of the year, and it becomes more difficult to get things completed when people are not around. So I would say get things started as soon as possible. If you can launch your reviews actually in November rather than December, you're giving people a lot longer to get it done. People can fit it around their own work challenges. As you say, many people are very, very busy trying to wrap up completing their objectives or delivering on work that they'd agreed to do by the end of the year. And they will always, like it or not, put the work they need to do over and above completing their reviews or doing sort of doing paperwork essentially. So we believe that review is really, really important. So the longer that you can give people, the higher the chances they are to actually get it done and have a conversation that's really valuable to them, their managers, but also the business. So there's a number of things that people can do to get that done. So making sure you've got your user data up to date, so you know who's being reviewed by who. Make sure you know what that review form is going to look like, whether it's something light touch or a bit longer. But also, if you've got the time, have a look back on what you did last time. What worked, what didn't work. Speak to employees to get their feedback. And use that to evolve and tweak the process so that it's even more useful and more valuable to everybody this time around. Many of our clients do, particularly though we have a lot of clients in regulated industries, finance, for example, where there is a requirement for them to have some sort of rating process at the end of the year. That's often linked to bonus, progression, pay awards, all of that sort of stuff. So you need time to get that completed. So obviously, first of all, you need your managers to provide the ratings. Obviously, that's easier if you've been doing continuous performance management throughout the year, because it's just a quick look at what we've done up until now and put the rating on at the end. But then that does pretty much universally for bigger companies need to go into some sort of moderation or calibration process. Which is really important to ensure consistency of approach to giving ratings, elimination of bias, and there may well be circumstances where you need to go back and look at evidence for why ratings have been given, and all of that can take a little bit of time. So the sooner you get that started, the more likely you are to get that process done by the end of the year and actually have everything you need to award those bonuses, decide on those pay awards, because ultimately people want to where there's been a culture of it, see that money in their paycheck at the end of the year. If things end up dragging on into January, it's not going to be fun for HR, because it's a process that's just going to drag into the new year, and employees probably won't be that happy either. So what I'd say is get it started as soon as possible. Even if you do the ratings before the review takes place. For those doing continuous, as I said, you should have all the evidence there. You should have objectives that have been worked on and evaluated throughout the year. You've probably built up some continuous feedback, but also you've had your regular check-ins to understand what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, what are the successes throughout the year. So it should be fairly straightforward for a manager just to look at all of that history that's been captured in a platform potentially, and then just come up with that rating, submit that off for calibration, and then they can have the conversation with the employee and communicate the final calibrated rating a little bit afterwards.
Yeah, quite agree. If you are doing the continuous performance process, it is so much better, because it means that the kind of amount of preparation for that reflective meeting, that review, is so much less, right? I think when people really struggle with these big annual appraisals of the old days, it's every manager's just thought, oh, I'm going to have to spend 2 hours at least sitting down in a dark room thinking about this person, everything they've done over the last year, and trying to write a summary of it, which is really, really difficult, especially at that time of year when everything else is really busy as well. So actually, if you are following the continuous process, you can often go into that meeting with minimal preparation. And then, which is great, because you're then spending your time talking about that person's future, reflecting on how they've done and showing them what progress they've made over the last 12 months. And then kind of brainstorming ideas for where they could be going over the next 12 months, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. But I would say for those people listening who haven't done continuous yet, don't be put off by what we're saying here. You can still do the annual appraisal in a way, or the annual review in a way that's not burdensome for everybody. So what I'd say on that front is keep it simple, keep it as light touch as possible. People get put off if there's really, really long forms and loads of questions that need to fill out, particularly if they feel that some of the questions aren't quite relevant to what they're doing. So keep it short, focus on what is the key information and the key discussion points that need to happen throughout that conversation. Build those out in the form and cut out anything that's not going to add value to you and your employees, and not going to be relevant to what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what about the steps that HR can take to make this process easier for the managers and employees themselves? I mean, you might also have an instance where a manager has, a large team, and they need to, sit down with each person and go through it all together. Any advice you would give?
Yes. So the first one would be something I touched on already, which is started as early as possible. Have that window open for as long as possible for people to do. Keep it simple, as I said, but also make sure that you're communicating to people so that they're aware of when the appraisal window is going to be launched, so they know they can start scheduling that in around other things. But also provide any necessary resources. If you are using a system and you've got new managers, think about whether you might want to have some videos or some drop-in sessions that managers can come to learn what it is that they need to do. So obviously you want to keep things as simple as possible, but some people do appreciate that support. So make sure that's available for people. Something I'd also recommend is a bit of guidance. it's one thing just to have some questions that people need to answer, but having some points that they can reflect on, or some tips to think about when having those discussions, can be really important, particularly for those managers. This might be their first round of ever doing a year-end review. You might have some first time managers that have been promoted into that role this year, and this is something that's totally new for them. So make sure that you've got training available or documentation for them to have a look at that gives them a few prompts and helps them to have that discussion and make it as impactful as possible.
Brilliant, thank you. So imagine you've come back from the summer holidays and suddenly it all starts looking a little bit autumnal, and you're getting ready for the run up to Christmas. That's the next sort of big milestone in the calendar. And you want to kind of really reinvigorate engagement with the whole performance management process. People have been away and so on, and their mind's been on other things. Is there anything that you would recommend HR can do in that sort of situation?
Something that we feel is really important is employees feeling like they have a stake within the process and their opinions are valid and respected. So what we think can be really valuable is gather feedback from your employees, whether that's through a survey, whether that's through a steering group, to reflect on what worked well last time, what people maybe found valuable, what they didn't find valuable, and use that to tweak the process going forward. Cut out anything that's not adding value. If you have been using a system, you could run some reports and look at engagement with certain questions, the type of answers that people are doing. If you've got a question in your form where people are just writing an answer same as above, it's probably quite a good indication that you could maybe remove it or consolidate it with another question. But what I would say when gathering that feedback, and face-to-face can be a really good way of doing it if possible, or through a call like this, is make sure you've got diversity of opinion and sort of demographics within that steering group. So it can be quite tempting to just speak to those people who are really engaged with the process, because they're more likely to volunteer to do these things. But you want a mixture of people who have historically been really engaged and really enthused with the process, but also those who've maybe it was a bit more of a struggle for you and them to get everything complete last year. So you want to make sure that you're getting opinions and feedback from all spectrum of employees, so you can then look at that, address it with those employees, but also use it to tweak your form and tweak your process going forward.
Absolutely. Finding an internal champion or three can just be amazing, right? You can find those head of a department or head of a team who's really keen to kind of show how they're, the right way of doing things, and getting those on side is always really helpful, I think.
I think also getting senior leadership buy-in is really important. So obviously you've got managers throughout the business doing this, but if you've got all of your department heads, for example, bought in, I've seen companies have a bit of a internal sort of game amongst their department heads, where they share their completion rates with the department heads, and you've got some who really want to be ahead of everybody else and beat their peers and get their department completing all of their reviews first. So you can get really good constructive downward pressure from department heads to ensure accountability and completion within their department. So it's not all just sat on HR to make sure everything's done. You've got people within the business chivying people along and ensuring that the process gets completed, because it shouldn't just be an HR process, the year-end review. It should be something that works for and is driven by the entirety of the business.
Excellent. So I think this is great advice, Richard. Thank you. It's, I think it applies to everybody who's doing, looking at the kind of run up to Christmas, their performance reviews, and whether they're doing it on an online system or they're doing it in Word or Excel. However, I am extremely biased, obviously, but I've seen the light. I know that if you're in HR, you do not want to spend your time chasing emails, extracting data from Word documents, knocking on people's doors. A system should do that for you, and you should be instead looking at analytics, understanding the reports, and making strategic decisions. Okay, so I'm completely biased. I'm going to be totally honest about that.
Yeah.
And that's what I'd like to see HR people doing. But they may think, well, that's impossible to get something like that up and running by Christmas. we're going to have to think about all our forms, all our templates. We're going to have to talk. We're going to have to consult senior leadership team and all of that. What would you say to somebody in that position who maybe sees this as a really kind of daunting process that they worry, they would have to sort of rush through?
Yeah, I'd say it doesn't have to be that way. It tends to be those with very long, sophisticated processes have worked up to that over a number of years in most instances. So what I'd say is it's very easy and quick to get something simple set up. As I touched on earlier, you can have a very simple form which is reflects on your objectives for the year if those have been set. If they've not, it can just be a question like thinking over the last 12 months, reflect on your performance, what have been some highlights and what have been some things that you wish you'd done differently. Just something really simple like that. Just a simple reflection on the year past. Just get people used to having a conversation, looking back, reflecting on their successes and thinking about where they'd like to go in the future. And you can then flip to looking forward, have that really simple end of year review, and then think about, right, what do we need to do to get things started for 2025? So how do we want people to write their objectives? And we have got sample templates out the box that people can use in a sort of smart objective format. We've got forms that people can use for year-end reviews, but also continuous check-ins going forward. So in summary, I'd say keep it really simple, start small, focus on the thing that's most important for people to do first, and just roll that out quickly, and then you can iterate from there. You can gather feedback from your staff on what's been done in the first instance and then evolve it from there. Many of our clients will start with a very simple review form and then set some objectives for the year going forward, and then they might over time incorporate sort of ad hoc check-ins and one-to-ones, feedback components, and gradually build up from there at a pace that employees are comfortable with, and it's not going to put them off and give them too much work to do.
We talked a lot about the year-end review and reflecting and so on, but how about looking forward to the next year? What can people do to start preparing for a really fantastic following year?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that most businesses do in January time, or maybe even as part of the year-end review, is the sort of the last little bit, is the looking forward and setting objectives and expectations for the year ahead. Something that we really advocate and think adds a lot of value to a business is communicating the overall business objectives and business strategy to your employees and having them link their individual objectives to that strategy. So if that is something that's right for you as a business, what I strongly recommend is start that process of setting that strategy as early as possible. You ideally want that ready to be communicated at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, so you're not delaying people setting their objectives. You don't want to be in a situation where you get to January, February, March time before that's communicated out, and you've almost got a quarter of the year where people haven't been able to set objectives that directly link to the strategy. So first of all, I'd say get that sorted, but also if there are any other business changes. Some people really focus on values and behaviors, so make sure you've got your, if that is make sure you've got your company values communicated out so that everybody is aligned with what are we trying to achieve as a business and how do we want to do that for 2025, so that when people come back in January, they're really clear on what they need to do and the fact that they're pulling all in one direction and what that direction might be.
Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
And if people would like to hear more about your thoughts on performance management and how the customer success team works at Appraisd, then they should contact you over LinkedIn, right? And connect to you there.
Yeah, of course.
Cool. And if you're listening to this on our website, don't forget you can also subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you very much and see you next time.